On the cold slopes of Mount Vesuvius in the winter of 73 BC, 70 exhausted men stood at the very edge of a sheer precipice, staring down into a darkness so deep it seemed bottomless. Below them waited a 200-foot drop ending in jagged volcanic rock. Behind them, 3,000 Roman soldiers tightened their encirclement, slowly starving them of food, water, and hope. The only path down the mountain had been blocked. There was no escape. To stay meant death by Roman steel, and to jump meant death on the rocks. And in that moment, Spartacus, the man destined to become a legend, gave the most unthinkable order imaginable. He told his men to leap off the cliff. But history is never written by the dead. When Spartacus and the men who trusted him hurled themselves into the abyss, they never hit the bottom. They disappeared. Later that morning, when Roman sentries looked over the cliff expecting to see shattered bodies, they found nothing. And by the time they realized what had actually happened, the gladiators were already standing behind them, ready to strike. To understand how this miracle of survival and ingenuity took place, the story must rewind 48 hours, to the moment the first Roman blood hit the Italian soil. At that time, Rome dominated the Mediterranean world, its economy built on the backs of slaves. 1 out of every 3 people walking along Roman roads bore the invisible weight of bondage. They plowed the fields, quarried the stone, built the temples, and died for entertainment in the arena. In the city of Capua stood the gladiator school of Batiatus, a grim factory of violence where human beings were shaped into instruments of spectacle. From this pit of misery rose 3 names that would one day frighten the entire republic. Spartacus, the Thracian, moved through the arena like a man carved from iron and instinct. Some whispered that he had once served in the Roman auxiliaries, which meant he knew not only how Rome fought, but also how Rome thought. Crixus, the massive Gaul, was all fury and raw power, a living battering ram who could shatter a shield rim with a single blow. Oenomaus, the seasoned Celt, older and scarred from 100 battles, understood tactics the way other men understood breathing. These men should have remained enemies, forced to kill one another for the pleasure of Rome. But oppression has a strange way of forging unity. In the rancid barracks of Batiatus's school, they became brothers. The spark that ignited everything began when Batiatus decided to sell a group of gladiators for a special event, one destined to end in blood. The fighters realized that death was coming either way and chose to meet it on their own terms. 200 gladiators stormed the kitchens, arming themselves with butcher knives, cleavers, roasting spits, and a handful of battered training swords. They overwhelmed the guards in a burst of speed and ferocity the school had never witnessed. Only 70 escaped the city. But those 70 would shake Rome to its core. Rome laughed at the initial reports. Why summon a legion to deal with a handful of escaped slaves? Instead, the Senate appointed Praetor Claudius Glaber, a man of political ambition but little military talent. He marched out with 3,000 militia, shopkeepers, farmers, tradesmen dressed in bronze helmets and carrying standard-issue weapons. They were eager for easy glory, convinced that slaughtering starving fugitives would earn them promotions and rewards. They had no idea what awaited them. Spartacus led his people up the rugged slopes of Vesuvius, a mountain not yet known for destruction, but already feared for its harsh terrain. Its lower slopes were tangled with vines and wild growth, while its upper cliffs rose almost straight into the sky. There was only one narrow path leading up, barely wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side. A natural fortress, a perfect place to die. When Glaber arrived, He immediately saw the obvious military truth. The fugitives had trapped themselves. With smug confidence, he blocked the only path down, pitched his tents, and ordered a comfortable siege. "Let them starve," he said. "Why risk Roman lives climbing uphill when time would do the killing?" His soldiers relaxed around their campfires, drinking wine, rolling dice, telling stories of their future rewards. They joked about how quickly the slaves would surrender once the last drop of water was gone. But while the Romans grew complacent and lazy, something far more important was unfolding above them. Every night, more escaped slaves crept through the forest to join Spartacus. 70 became 300, then 500, then 700. Oenomaus organized them with military precision. Crixus drilled the strongest in close combat. Spartacus arranged watch rotations and rationing, but for all their efforts, they remained trapped. Starvation would break them long before they could break through 3,000 armed men blocking the only descent. Except Spartacus noticed something the Romans never bothered to see. The upper cliffs of Vesuvius were covered in wild vines, thick and ancient, some nearly as wide as a man's wrist. Their roots clung to volcanic stone, and their fibers were astonishingly strong. One evening, Spartacus picked up a vine and pulled with all his strength. It didn't snap. Another man tried. It still held. On the battlefield, Spartacus was a warrior, but on that mountain he became something else entirely. A problem solver staring at the impossible until it cracked. As night swallowed the summit, the gladiators gathered around the vines, cutting them down with whatever blades they had, stripping leaves, twisting the fibers together. They worked in silence, the kind of tense, desperate silence forged only when every beat of the heart echoes the same shared thought. This is our only chance. The first vine rope measured 50 feet, nowhere near enough, but they kept weaving, splicing the lengths together the way they once repaired equipment for the arena. Every connection was tested by the weight of 2 men. At last, they had long, thick cables of living rope stretching into the darkness below. Spartacus took the first rope, not because he had something to prove, but because if he fell, the others would know the plan was hopeless. The rebellion depended not on his survival, but on his courage. He wrapped the vine around his waist and approached the cliff. 700 men watched in breathless silence as their leader stepped over the edge and vanished into the night. The rope groaned under his weight. Volcanic stones scraped his knuckles until they bled. But the hands of a gladiator were calloused from years of gripping swords, slick with sweat and blood. He descended slowly, carefully, every inch a conversation between gravity and willpower. Halfway down, the rope snagged against a sharp outcrop. A wrong movement meant instant death. Spartacus swung his body, gaining momentum until the tension shifted and the vine slipped free. He continued downward, 100 feet, 150, and finally, his boots touched earth behind the Roman lines. A soft whistle drifted upward. The signal. Crixus went next, the mountain barely able to contain his massive weight as he half climbed, half slid down the rope. Then Oenomaus, then dozens more. Night after night of hunger had carved them into lean, feral survivors. Even when ropes snapped near the bottom and men crashed onto the rocks, they staggered to their feet and crawled into hiding. Pain meant nothing. Pain had been their companion for years. For 4 long hours the descent continued. At any moment a Roman could have looked up and seen shadowy shapes sliding down the cliff. But the guards were bored, tired, and drunk. Their eyes stayed on their dice and their wine cups. One by one, 2 by 2, The gladiators touched down behind enemy lines until 700 shadows were waiting silently in the darkness. The hunters had become the prey. Spartacus raised his hand, a gesture he had once used to signal readiness in the arena. The men behind him tightened their grips on kitchen knives, stolen swords, sharpened stakes. The Roman camp lay sprawled before them, disorganized and unguarded, a maze of tents glowing faintly in the firelight. Glaber snored inside his pavilion, dreaming of the victory he believed already won. Crixus moved first, gliding through the darkness with surprising stealth. He reached the nearest sentry, clamped a huge hand over the man's mouth, and drove a blade into the gap beneath the helmet. The Roman died without a sound. His spear passed to the hands of a slave who clutched it like a gift from the gods. The impossible had begun. Night thickened over the Roman camp as the gladiators spread outward like a silent tide, absorbing the darkness and moving with deadly purpose. The first body fell without a sound, and from that moment, the balance of power shifted with every breath drawn on that mountainside. 700 fugitives who hours earlier had been starving on a cliff now held weapons taken from Roman hands. Each blade, each spear, each helmet captured in the shadows became a spark fueling what was about to erupt. The second sentry died as quickly as the first. Then a third, his throat slit before he even realized he was not alone. As the gladiators advanced through the outer ring of tents, they killed with an efficiency born not from military tradition, but from survival instinct sharpened in the crucible of the arena. There were no shouted commands among them, no marching orders, no horns or drums. They communicated with glances, gestures, small movements, learned from years of fighting for spectacle, under the lights of the amphitheater. The Romans, scattered in their sleep, wrapped in blankets and the illusion of safety, had no such advantage. A single misstep changed everything. A drunken Roman soldier stumbled out of his tent to relieve himself, rubbing his eyes, still half dreaming. He froze when he saw the shapes moving between the tents, shapes that should not have existed, shapes that should have been starving on the summit above. He managed a single scream before a blade opened his throat, but the damage was done. The camp awoke in chaos. Shouts erupted in every direction. Soldiers tore through tent flaps, scrambling for armor, reaching for weapons they had not expected to need for days. Fires kicked up as men knocked them over in panic. Horses began to scream, and through it all, Spartacus and his people moved like phantoms. They did not roar into battle like soldiers eager for glory. They slipped between shadows, exploiting fear, letting terror do half their work. A Roman who saw a gladiator approaching did not see a man. He saw a nightmare, a creature he believed had climbed out of the sky in the middle of the night. In the heart of the camp, a centurion struggled to restore order. He bellowed commands, ordering the militia to form ranks, lock shields, hold the center. But his men were not legionaries hardened by years of marching and death. They were farmers and merchants dressed up in bronze, terrified and disoriented in the dark. Their shield wall formed for only a moment before it collapsed under the force of Crixus barreling into them, his stolen spear striking like a battering ram. The formation crumbled, and the gladiators flooded into the gap with ruthless precision. Every Roman who fell sent a ripple of fear through those around him. Every weapon taken by a slave meant another Roman disadvantage. Panic was contagious, spreading faster than any order of discipline could counteract. The militia tried to retreat uphill, away from the shadows closing in on them, but the slope betrayed them. Men slipped on loose gravel, fell over tent ropes, collided with their own comrades. Some tumbled down the incline in fits of terror, their helmets clanging, their limbs snapping against rocks. And waiting at the bottom of those slopes were gladiators with sharp blades and feral resolve. Glaber himself awoke to the sound of his army collapsing. He sat up in his tent, disoriented, hearing screams from every direction. He called for his guards, but no one answered. When he staggered outside, half armoring himself in desperation, he saw only chaos, flashes of metal in the dark, shadows moving where no shadows should be, men bleeding out on the trampled grass. For a brief moment, he believed the rumors that would later spread across Italy, that the slaves had flown down the mountain like demons. He tried to rally a last stand, but the gladiators surged toward him from all sides. He swung his sword once, twice, wild and panicked, before the weapons of a dozen former slaves pierced him. There was no heroic duel, no glorious final strike. Glaber died in confusion, disbelief still etched on his face. The praetor of Rome never understood how 70 starving fugitives had multiplied into 700, how they had descended a wall of stone that should have killed them, or how his entire army had been undone by arrogance in the span of a single night. The fighting lasted nearly 3 hours. By the time the last pockets of resistance had been crushed, the camp was a landscape of flickering firelight and scattered bodies. Smoke drifted through the air, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the unmistakable stench of fear. The gladiators moved steadily through the carnage, stripping armor and weapons from the fallen. Bronze helmets replaced rags, Roman shields replaced improvised wooden planks. The kitchen knives they had once clung to like lifelines were thrown aside, forgotten in the dirt. They had taken the identity of their enemy and forged it into their own. When dawn crept over the horizon, its pale light cast long shadows across a battlefield that no one could have imagined the day before. What had once been a Roman encampment now looked like the remains of a massacre without survivors. Of 3,000 militia, fewer than 200 escaped the slaughter, running down the mountain in blind terror, carrying with them tales so exaggerated by fear that they bordered on myth. They spoke of men who descended from the heavens, shadows that killed without sound, and a leader who commanded death with a single gesture. For the gladiators, morning brought silence, a silence so deep it almost felt sacred. Spartacus stood among the bodies, staring out over the valley as the sun warmed the cold air. Around him, his people tightened straps on newly claimed armor, inspected their new swords, adjusted helmets that had moments earlier belonged to the oppressors who once mocked them. Something fundamental had changed on that mountain. They were no longer runaways. They were no longer slaves. They were something Rome had never imagined possible: an army. The sun climbed slowly over Mount Vesuvius, revealing a world transformed. The battlefield that stretched across the slopes no longer looked like the remnants of a Roman encampment, but like a stage on which fate had rewritten the order of power. The gladiators, still catching their breath after the night's unthinkable triumph, moved among the bodies with an almost ritual solemnity. They did not celebrate. Victory had come at a cost, measured not only in Roman lives, but in the weight of what they had now become. Spartacus stood in the center of it all, his body streaked with blood, some of it Roman, some of it his own. He did not feel the cuts or bruises. What he felt instead was the dawning realization that their desperate leap from the cliff had grown into something far larger than survival. Around him, men who hours earlier had been half-starved fugitives were now fully armed, wearing the armor of the very soldiers who had hunted them. A transformation had taken place, one that could not be undone. The world would hear about what happened here, and Rome would never see them as mere slaves again. When Ammias moved through the wreckage with a tactical eye, cataloging weapons, counting shields, inspecting the Roman supply wagons that had survived the chaos, he knew an army could not live on courage alone. It needed steel, food, discipline. Crixus barked orders to groups of men, arranging them into rough units, teaching them how to hold a Roman shield properly, how to lock into formation, how to strike with precision rather than wild fury. He had always fought like a storm, but now he fought with purpose. For the first time in his life, the Gaul was free to choose the target of his rage, and he chose Rome. But as the gladiators worked, figures began appearing on the distant slopes, dozens at first, then hundreds. Dirt-covered, gaunt, wrapped in tattered cloth, limping, crying, running. These were not soldiers. They were slaves from the surrounding farms, the mines, the villas, the workshops of Campania. They had heard the screams from the mountain. They had seen the smoke, and the rumors had reached them in the night like a spark thrown into dry grass. The slaves had risen. The Romans had fallen. Spartacus had defeated 3,000 soldiers with his bare hands. Hope travels faster than a horse. They came in waves, some cheering, some weeping, some crawling on bleeding knees toward the men who had done what no one else dared imagine. They begged to join, begged for weapons, begged simply not to be left behind. Some carried nothing but broken chains. Others held tools stolen from fields, hoes, axes, sickles. A few carried the bodies of friends who had tried to flee and been beaten for it. Spartacus watched as the number of people swelled from hundreds to thousands, spreading across the slopes like a gathering storm cloud. He felt the weight of their eyes on him. They were not looking at a man. They were looking at salvation. Spartacus had never wanted to lead an army. He wanted freedom, his own, and perhaps that of a few who shared his fate. But as the haggard masses circled him, he understood that freedom was no longer something he could claim for himself alone. The people crawling toward him, clutching his legs, kissing the hem of his stolen Roman armor, were desperate not just for a leader, but for meaning. And he, whether he wished it or not, had become the symbol they needed. By midday, more than 2,000 new followers had arrived. By evening, the number grew past 4,000. Not all were fighters. Many were women, children, the elderly. Many were too weak to march or carry weapons. The Roman supplies stolen from Glaber's camp were generous by a soldier's standards, but a drop of water against the thirst of thousands. Oenomaus counted the food with a grim face. They had won a battle, perhaps even a miracle, but now they faced a much larger, much more unforgiving war. The war of survival. Crixus, ever the blunt voice of truth, argued that they should move immediately, taking only those strong enough to fight, leaving behind those who would slow them down. But Spartacus shook his head. He had not thrown himself off a cliff to save a handful of men. He had not fought in the arena all these years only to abandon those who shared his chains. If they left the weak behind, the Romans would slaughter them to send a message. If they carried the weak with them, Rome would come with armies. There was no path without blood. As night fell again over Vesuvius, the camp of the newly freed stretched so far that campfires looked like a constellation fallen onto the earth. Children stared at Spartacus with wide eyes as he passed, whispering his name with reverence. Women touched his arm as though he were a living myth. Even men hardened by fields and mines regarded him with awe. Spartacus did not bask in it. He felt it like an iron collar around his neck. When Amyas approached him quietly while the others slept, he spoke with the calm that had guided him through decades of slaughter. "You know what comes next," he said. Spartacus nodded. Rome would return, not with 3,000 militia this time, but with legions, real soldiers, men trained for war since childhood, disciplined, ruthless, and led by commanders who understood strategy rather than politics. Glaber's defeat had been humiliating, but Rome did not tolerate humiliation. They would answer with overwhelming force. Yet Spartacus looked out over the thousands sleeping around them and whispered, "We cannot run." When Amyas did not argue, both men knew the truth. Even if Spartacus had chosen to flee north with only the gladiators, the sight of thousands of slaves flocking to their banner meant the rebellion had already outgrown escape. It had become an idea, and ideas do not run. In the early hours before dawn, Spartacus walked among his people, listening to their breathing, watching them clutch stolen shields as if they were amulets. Some dreamed of revenge, others dreamed of a world without whips, without collars, without fear. For most, this was the first night they had ever slept without a master's watchful eye. He felt something shift inside him, as though the mountain itself were whispering a revelation. He had not chosen this destiny, but it had chosen him the moment he stepped into the arena, the moment he broke his chains, the moment he stepped over the cliff's edge. The rebellion was no longer a flicker of defiance. It was a fire, and he was standing at its center. Far below, the first surviving Roman scouts were racing toward the nearest garrison, carrying stories soaked in terror. They would say the slaves came down the mountain like spirits. They would say the gods had turned against Rome. They would say the impossible had happened. And Rome, for the first time in generations, would tremble. The days that followed felt unreal, as if the world itself struggled to keep pace with what had happened on Vesuvius. Word spread through the countryside faster than any patrol could suppress it. Farmers whispered it over their plows. Servants murmured it in kitchens. Chained workers in quarries passed it along in the clatter of stone on stone. Gladiators had destroyed a Roman army. The impossible had become truth, and every slave in Italy felt the tremor of that truth in their bones. Within a week, the camp around Spartacus grew from a swelling crowd into a wandering nation. Families arrived in ragged clusters, fleeing plantations and mines, their wounds still fresh, their chains sometimes dangling from their wrists. The smell of fear mixed with excitement. Children clung to their parents, staring at the armored gladiators with awe. Some had crossed miles of hostile territory, hiding during the day, moving only at night. Others dragged the bodies of loved ones who had died on the journey, refusing to leave them to decay on Roman roads. All came carrying the same fragile hope. Spartacus would save them. But hope was a burden as heavy as any shield. As the multitude grew, the pressure on supplies grew with it. The food captured from Glaber's camp vanished within days. Water became a daily struggle. Amyas organized hunting parties and foraging units, but the land itself could not sustain so many. Spartacus spent hours walking through the encampment, listening to the coughing of the sick, the crying of children, the pleas of newcomers begging for weapons. He felt stretched between two worlds, the warrior who wanted to strike Rome again and again, and the leader responsible for thousands who depended on him for life itself. Rome, meanwhile, reeled from humiliation. News reached the Senate like a wound reopening every time it was touched. A praetor had died. 3,000 soldiers had been wiped out by men who weeks earlier had been considered livestock. The senators argued, shouting over one another, some calling for immediate legions, others insisting it was still a minor uprising that could be handled by another militia force. Pride clouded judgment. Rome had never faced a rebellion like this. It did not know how to measure danger that came from below. Another praetor was dispatched with fresh troops, convinced that Glaber's failure had been an anomaly, not an omen. His arrogance mirrored his predecessors. He believed discipline would restore order. He did not understand that discipline meant little when facing men who no longer feared death. While Rome debated, Spartacus and his growing army began to move. Staying on Vesuvius was impossible. The mountain had been a cradle for their rebirth, but it offered neither shelter nor food for the thousands now following them. They descended into the countryside, marching across fields that had once been plowed by the very hands now carrying Roman shields. As they traveled, more slaves joined them. Shepherds from the hills, miners covered in gray dust, cooks who still smelled of kitchens they had fled. Every hour, their numbers swelled. Yet not all who came were prepared for the harsh reality of rebellion. Some carried dreams sharper than any sword, imagining instant triumph and Roman cities falling with a single charge. They saw Spartacus not as a man, but as destiny walking in human form. Crixus embraced these new recruits with fire, urging them to seize vengeance while it was within reach. He wanted to strike Rome head-on, to tear apart its cities, to drag its elites from their marble villas. Spartacus, though, hesitated. He understood the difference between rage and strategy. Rage won battles. Strategy won wars. And they were no longer fighting for a night or a mountain or even a single victory. They were fighting for something far larger. Freedom for tens of thousands. Freedom for generations. Freedom that required more than passion. It required outsmarting a nation built on conquest. But the argument simmered beneath the surface. Crixus pushing for boldness, Eunomaus urging caution, Spartacus balancing between them. The men respected him, but their hunger for revenge was growing. Each Roman patrol they encountered fell quickly under the weight of their numbers. Every success fed the fire. By the second week after Vesuvius, the slave army had grown to nearly 10,000, a river of humanity moving through the Italian countryside, armed with whatever could be scavenged or stolen. Rome could no longer pretend the rebellion was a small disturbance. It had become a storm stretching across the land. Spartacus stood on a hill overlooking the vast encampment one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. Thousands of fires flickered in the dark, each marking a family, a fighter, a story that had escaped servitude. He watched silhouettes move among them, men sharpening swords, women tending to the wounded, children playing with discarded helmets far too big for their heads. The sight was overwhelming, beautiful, terrifying. Eunomaus approached quietly. "This cannot last," he said. Spartacus nodded. They both knew the truth. The larger the rebellion grew, the more impossible it became to feed, to arm, to protect. And the larger it grew, the more determined Rome would be to destroy it. Crixus joined them soon after, his tone impatient. "We march on Rome," he insisted. "We strike before they gather their strength." His eyes burned with conviction, the kind that could inspire thousands or doom them. Spartacus stared into the distance where the lights of distant estates glowed like scattered coins. "If we attack Rome now," he said quietly, "we die. All of us." Crixus bristled, but Spartacus raised a hand. "Rome will send legions. Not militia, not farmers with spears, real soldiers, and when they come, they will not underestimate us again." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. If we are to survive, we must think beyond the next battle. The firelight flickered across his face as he added, "And Rome must unlearn everything it believes about us." Below them, the sound of thousands breathing, shifting, living in the night, carried across the air like the pulse of a new world being born. They had torn a hole in Rome's illusion of invincibility. But maintaining that victory would require more than courage. It would require outmaneuvering an empire. And Rome, slowly realizing the scale of what had begun, was preparing to answer with vengeance,